Hello everyone, I'm Charlotte Thun-Hohenstein for BTRtv. On this week's episode of Third Eye Weekly, you can hear co-host Matthew DeMello chatting with Peter Singer, director of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at the Brookings Institute and co-author of the new book out now on Oxford University Press titled Cybersecurity and Cyberwar, What Everyone Needs to Know. BTRtv was able to catch up with Singer a few weeks ago on the subject of cybersecurity and how we can wrap our heads around the issue, from the future of cyber warfare to our own personal lives on the internet. Hi Peter, so how much of a risk is there for a cyber Pearl Harbor? I mean, the most critical components, you say in your book that the most critical components of critical infrastructure are actually the most vulnerable, and certainly we hear this term thrown around all the time in the media. What would that even look like in your view if it were to happen, and what is the risk of it happening?
Well, it's interesting, we live in this time of incredible cyber dependence from the, almost 30 trillion websites that are out there to, our dependence in our communication and commerce and infrastructure on the internet. But given all this cyber dependence, we also live in a time of cyber insecurity, and I think that use of the term cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11, there have been over 500,000 media references to these terms out there. It's a good illustration of it because the reality is when we're looking at the cyber threats, there's very real cyber threats. Look, I wrote a book on it, but we also need to weigh and measure them from these kind of fictionalized scenarios where particularly the experts, if you're making a joke, turn the volume up to 11. So the power grid scenario, to be blunt, to be direct, squirrels have taken down the power grid more times than the 0 times that hackers have. That doesn't mean there's not a danger, but if we're trying to weigh the risks that are out there, for example, I put, rather than the fictional potential of a cyber Pearl Harbor, I put the very real and ongoing death by 1,000 cut scenario of the massive campaign of intellectual property theft that China's been engaged in, almost $1 trillion worth of value that's been lost by aerospace companies to small furniture companies. I put that in a greater consequence. So, another part of this is don't let your fears drive you into doing things that will make the situation worse. One of the lessons we've learned from real terrorism also holds true in cyber terrorism. Sometimes the response can make a bad situation even worse, and we can see that in some of the underlying issues that's playing out with the NSA scandal right now.
So how dangerous do you think this type of rhetoric is for policymakers, for everyday people thinking about the issues? Is it a massive distraction, or is there not some value to shock factor just to get people to engage with a topic that might otherwise go over their heads?
It's really fascinating. I remember speaking with a guy at the White House who worked on these issues, and he described it as this way. He said, cybersecurity was treated as an area, and this is his quote, just for the nerds. And so the nerds would get frustrated that people weren't listening to them, and so then they would come up with these extreme scenarios to try and make people pay attention, to try and make them spend the needed money. The problem of that is, it only goes so far, and then it starts to undermine the trust that we all need in this space. And the way I think about it is this way. There is no issue that's more important in recent years in cybersecurity that's less understood. And that's true whether you're talking about the politicians, the businessmen, the media, military, to our role as citizens, our role as parents in protecting our family. There's this huge disconnect that you can see there. To give you an illustration, in a number of ways, 70% of business executives, not 70% of CTOs or CSOs, but of executives in general, have made some kind of cybersecurity decision for their company, and yet no major MBA program teaches it as a matter of your sort of general management training. Same thing for you as a journalist. Journalists deal with cyber questions, not just in their reporting, but many major media have been hacked, and yet they're not taught on it. To lawyers, to how we teach our kids. A real effective thing we ought to be doing right now is teaching our kids cyber hygiene. Just like we teach them to wash their hands. The same thing here in how they should protect themselves in the online world. And I like the idea of hygiene for 2 reasons. One, Studies have shown that what Benjamin Franklin said about, an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure, it holds true not just in regular sickness, but in cyber. It's a lot better to play it that way. But also when you think about hygiene, you're teaching your kids that not just to protect themselves, but also to have an ethic to protect others. That's why you cover your mouth when you cough. It's the same thing with cyber. You should be doing these kind of things, these very basic things to protect yourself, but also to help protect the rest of us online. And that's to me the way we need to change the discussion about this.
Well, you mentioned in your book that ultimately, really strong cybersecurity is going to come from a lot of coordination from all levels of society. And you just mentioned right now, something that you mentioned in the book, the importance of that ethic of individual responsibility. Can you legislate that? How do you build that ethic that we seem to be lacking right now, even if it's just out of misunderstanding?
It's funny, and I may be getting a little too simplistic here, but along with the hygiene lesson, there's other things that we learn in preschool that apply over here, and one's the importance of sharing. And you can think about that in the importance of sharing information about threats and good practices to respond, which we see some industries do very well, like the banking industry, and we see other industries not do very well, particularly critical infrastructure when it comes to like the power companies and the like. Sharing in terms of sharing our responsibility. The players on the internet range from government, like you mentioned, governments large, small, federal government at a national level down to state, local, but it also, the users of the internet are organizations that range from companies to non-state actors to you or I. We all have power, we all face threats, we all share responsibility here. And part of this, as you were getting at, is you're not going to be able to legislate your way out of it. That's not going to work. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that there's not a role for the government. And this is where there's been a gap. The last time Congress was able to pass legislation on major cybersecurity legislation was the year 2002. That's 5 years before anyone had heard of the iPhone, let alone all the issues today of metadata, Google Glass, you name it. So Congress needs to catch up on this, but it is also understanding that it's about helping to raise the level, raise standards. Anyone who thinks the market is going to solve this on their own, well, they should look at examples like the Titanic or 3 Mile Island. At the end of the day, there's also a role for government to play, but it can't over-regulate. It's all about finding that sense of balance, that sense of awareness, that sense of sharing our role in this space.
I mean, you also talk about, and you mentioned just now, this huge gap in understanding. Is there not a case to be made that at this point in time, even if we need more legislation, if policymakers don't understand cybersecurity at all, maybe having no law is better than having the wrong type of law? Do you feel that way about the situation right now, or do you think we're ready to actually start legislating things?
It's a really good question, and you can think about it in two ways. There's definitely that awareness gap, particularly among senior policymakers. I mean, as one guy in the book puts it, the people who are sitting in the big boy chairs, be it in government or the CEOs or the Supreme Court justices, they didn't start using computers till they were in their 30s and 40s. They didn't use it in university or the like. But to me, what's worse than that is sometimes that attitude that celebrates, Ludditism, celebrates technical ignorance. For example, in the book, one example we give is that the former Secretary of Homeland Security, the civilian agency ostensibly in charge of cybersecurity, she proudly talked to us about how she didn't use email, and in fact she hadn't used social media for over a decade. Not because she didn't think it was insecure, but she didn't think it was useful. Would have her assistant print out emails to her. You can't have that kind of attitude and think you're going to handle these issues effectively. But that said, it doesn't mean that we still don't need effort and activity in this space. Again, because we're seeing, critical gaps that need to be shored, whether it's these areas of regulation to what we're spending on. While people may not be all that aware of it, we're spending huge amounts on it. For example, the Pentagon budget, this just illustrates the growth. a couple years ago, the word cyber was used 4 times. In the current budget, it's used 147 times.
Wow.
And this same thing if you were, working in a business, whether, your business is paint or your business is aerospace. You're dealing with cybersecurity issues right now, and so we have to catch up to that.
So just one final question for you, because we've heard a lot about the militarization of cyberspace, and certainly Stuxnet was a very notorious example of that. How great is the danger of government's military exploits, even research, spilling into civilian life accidentally? Because this seems to be one of the most uncomfortable features of cyberspace, is that government and civilians are sharing it.
Mm-hmm. I think there's very real concern both about the militarization in this space, but also brewing arms races. On the militarization side, there's over 100 nations that have built some kind of cyber military command capability. And we've seen these various activities, like you mentioned, the development of weapons in the space like Stuxnet. The difference with traditional conflict is that this will all take place in the civilian-owned and operated internet. So it's going to be happening on the same networks that we depend on for our communications, to sharing QCat videos. That makes it very different from previous styles of conflict. The arms race side, for me, the concern is that classic outcome of arms races where nations spend more and more but end up feeling less and less secure. And I think we're starting to see that right now in cybersecurity, or rather we could say maybe cyber insecurity, where we're certainly spending more in these areas, whether you're talking about the Pentagon budget or you're talking about businesses or the like. The budget has boomed in this space. And yet the first poll of 2014 that Pew did showed that Americans fear a cyber attack more than they fear North Korean or Iranian nuclear weapons, the rise of China, Russia, or climate change. So,
do you think that's valid?
It's a good question. It all depends on how you weigh things. So on one hand, they're more likely to be touched by certain kinds of cyber attacks in terms of, bank account hacking or the like, but I think the scenario that they're all thinking about, the cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber 9/11, that's far less likely than maybe the way it's framed in our discourse. But the bottom line, what I'm getting at here, is that arms races historically, whether you're talking about battleships or nuclear weapons or now in cyber, the general outcome of them has been more and more spending but feeling less and less secure. And that's a dangerous place to be in. And if I hate the comparisons to the Cold War. This is very different than the Cold War. But if there is any parallel to the Cold War, it's those early days of it where we didn't understand both the technology but also all the dynamics that it was driving. And even worse, those were the days where we took the real-world versions of Dr. Strangelove seriously. And that's a lot of what characterizes this space right now. So at the end of the day, we have to collectively get smart, get aware, start thinking in an approach to this about how do we build management, resilience, because as long as we use the internet, there will be cybersecurity and cyber war questions. And we just have to own up to that and deal with it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And for further on this, people can check out cybersecuritybook.com. I
actually have the book right here, and I can say that it was an extremely good read, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it, because it is on the topic of cybersecurity. But yeah, it was fantastic. Very sobering and hopeful, actually.
Okay.
So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day. Bye. Thank you again to Peter Singer. That was an incredible opportunity. I also got the chance to talk to Laura Lambert, CEO and co-founder of London tech startup Befittd, about how she learned to become tech savvy for her business. Laura, I was just talking with Peter Singer about cybersecurity and cyber warfare and the line between the two. You're in the tech world in London, but on the sort of commercial side of things. When you hear these headlines all the time. Does that worry you specifically from your own point of view, being in the tech world, or is it just so remote from your enterprise right now that you think it couldn't affect you?
No, I mean, I think when you work in tech, you realize that with tech, any piece of software you create will have loopholes, and that applies both on a corporate level with what we do at Befittd, but also on a personal level or even a governmental level. So if you're trying to regulate tech law, for example, you can't make a law to legislate against something that you don't know exists yet, obviously. So what you get in a way is very similar, I think, to financial regulation, where somebody will commit what society deems to be an offence. We will legislate against it, and then people will then try and push the envelope and kind of find ways around that law that was created. So it's a constant process, really. And I think, all elements of tech are open to that kind of procedure.
Was cybersecurity a massive priority for you when you were building up your company from scratch? Because I know that your company relies really heavily on getting the algorithms right, and it is very tech intensive. So was this like a big priority for you?
I mean, it was definitely something that we considered, and we put what we deemed to be the necessary and appropriate ring fences in place. But having done so, I wouldn't say that it's something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. But being involved in the tech scene, of course, those kinds of headlines do tend to catch your eye, and it is something you think about. And I find the kind of moral politics of cyber hacking and the relationship that people have with technology, going forwards, an increasingly intimate relationship, really interesting, just kind of as an offshoot, I guess, of my work. But I find that interesting on a personal level.
Have you, since starting this company, become much more conscientious in your own personal habits when it comes to cybersecurity?
I definitely have, because you know what, when you spend all day, every day with coders, you start to realize, you get a better sort of conceptual understanding of the capabilities of coding, or, phishing, which would, how you describe a general attack on a consumer, and it does make you more aware of your own day-to-day behavior. So, for example, I asked one of my guys today, in preparation for this show, listen, if you wanted to get my bank details, how would you do it? And he said, that is the easiest thing in the world. I could send you an email, I would fake the sender address to mimic your bank, and I could completely recreate your bank's homepage with a small change in the URL. You would then log on and essentially give me your details into a fake page, which I could then use in the real bank. So, I mean, what's really interesting, I think, from that for consumers is just to realize kind of the parameters of what you can and can't trust on the internet, and be sensible about it. So all major banks will give you a piece of advice, which is don't ever click through to our site from a link. Always enter our URL immediately into your URL browser bar. And the reason for that is because that immediately circumvents that kind of phishing attack.
Yeah. Did you, when you were building up your company, did you have any external support from governmental or private sector groups, or was it just your team that you assembled working on everything?
No, that was just my team.
Cool. And how does the increasingly emotional experience of our electronic devices affect our expectations of security in your view? Because they certainly seem to be becoming more and more companion-like, pet-like even. Do you think that this might foster a false sense of trust or security with them?
I think that's a really pertinent and quite a kind of nuanced question, and exactly the one that we all should be asking ourselves actually is essentially when you have a smartphone in your pocket, you are carrying your work email history, your bank details, the ability to pay for things on the spot. Those are the kind of apps and the kind of initiatives that are being developed. That's, a single device. If you imagine otherwise, it would be the equivalent of trying to fit, a desktop and 10 bank cards into your pocket. Like you wouldn't leave that on the tube as easily. So right, I think the point there is that when we're closer bonded with our technology and when we share more with it, we also leave ourselves open to the ability to lose it to other people in a slightly different way than when things were slightly more remote from us.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And furthermore, just to complicate things, phones, even smartphones, are so much less secure than computers. That's another, added vulnerability. But Laura, your background is really interesting because you did history at Oxford. So you're not, or as far as it seems to me, you were not a tech person to begin with.
I'm not
yet now you are heading up this tech company. I mean, how did you do that? How did you catch up? And what were some things that helped you when you were learning about this whole world?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, you know, I wouldn't even describe myself as a proper tech person now, but I definitely work in that world and I'm very immersed in it. But I think really the key is that anybody can have a conceptual understanding of technology and of the kind of software that governs our day-to-day lives, even if you don't know how to physically create it yourself. So, you know, in my case, I spent a lot of time with people with a tech background. I work every day with coders, and I kind of started to learn the limitations and the potential of what we can do with our code and how we can develop it. But I mean, I think on a more kind of personal consumer level, what that's definitely taught me outside the classroom, as it were, is, you know, as Peter mentioned very correctly, there is a huge amount of sort of sensationalism in the media about this topic. And I think the use of the word war is very interesting, because war implies, you know, forces of opposition and a winner and a loser, and that's not the case at all, really. It's a much more of a sort of disparate, individualistic situation. And really, I think if every individual was more comfortable and responsibly informed of the small things they can do to keep themselves tech safe, which you learn when you spend a lot of time with coders and with people who work in technology, it means that you're not scared to behave in that way. Whereas I think that there is a kind of smoke and mirrors aura around technology often that means that people are just too scared to kind of do anything that they think would be wrong, basically.
Well, in Peter's book, he talks about, you know, the metaphor of public health and thinking of your own cybersecurity as you would, you know, your biological health, which I think is like a very down to earth and approachable way to think about it, and this sense of, you know, ongoing checking in, you know, in small ways that, you know, can lead to daily health. But Laura, just to finish up, because I think we covered everything, what do you say to people who have ideas for businesses, who want to get involved maybe in the startup scene, but are scared off by, you know, the technical knowledge that they think is required to develop these ideas, or even just to choose a team of programmers? What do you say to those people?
Well, that is the hardest single thing in the world. In a way, ideas are cheap, because if you think you've had a great idea, the chances are someone else has had it first.
Right.
But finding the right team to execute it really well and getting it off the ground, that is definitely the difficult bit. What I always say to people is that we are increasingly living in an age where there are accelerators, there are meetups, there are, you know, websites, there are places that you can go if you're interested to find these people and to start beating the drum and making them take notice of you. And, you know, there are wonderful things like all the Y Combinator essays that come out of there. There's, you know, there's such a wealth of information about startup culture now in a way that is really increasing, you know, as we speak. It's such an immediate phenomenon. And I think that, you know, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you're going to have to be so self-motivated and try so hard on a day-to-day basis that finding out where to start should be the least of your worries. It's only going to get more difficult from there, chances are. Great.
Well, that is, you know, super optimistic advice there.
No, but I'm just saying, you know, the kind of people who go on to succeed are the kind of people who will figure out how to make the first step.
Right. So it sounds like the advice there is basically to just make that first step and to just
reach out to anyone you know in the space, go onto websites, you know, get in touch with people. It's a very open community. Just get talking, basically, because people respect that kind of courage and upfront behavior, and you will need that and 10 times over if you actually get to the point of founding a company.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Laura. We're going to have to stop there. That was Laura Lambert, CEO of Befittd in London. Thanks, Laura.